Good afternoon. I want to thank all of you for being here with us. My name is Lisa Poff. I am the project director for the Indiana Deafblind Services Project. And I'm so happy that so many of you have decided to be in our early identification of children with deaf blindness webinar with Dr. Susan Bashinsky. I'm going to let her talk a little bit more about herself in a moment. I just wanted to start everybody off with some logistics. First, our Zoom is set so that when you enter the room, all of the participant microphones and webcams are off. And if you would keep yourself muted unless there is a discussion or Susan asks for some input from people vocally. Throughout the session, what you can do is post general comments and questions in the chat box, and that is available for everybody to view. It's going to be monitored. I'll keep track of that so that any questions that you have will be answered. In order to get to the chat box, probably everybody knows by now, but there is a toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and there's a space to click on chat for that, and you can type in your comment or question and then just click send. We do have captions on today. If you need to turn, I think they're already on for everyone, but if not, you can check at the toolbar at the bottom of the screen and turn them on in the captioning button. We're also recording today, and this webinar would be made available to folks at a later time, probably through our YouTube channel. Let's see, another quick note. I hope all of you completed the pre-test before coming into the session. If not, you can probably now do it quickly using the link I sent to your email. After this session, I'm going to ask you to complete a post-test and a session evaluation. I will send you an email with a link for that, and you have to complete each in order to receive your certificate. If you have any problems today, you can send me a note in the chat box, or I will put my email and phone number in there really quickly so that if something happens and you get booted out, you'll have that information to contact me and I'll try to fix it for you. You got all the handouts and the PowerPoint for today earlier in the week in the email. So let us know if you didn't get everything or if you have problems with any of the files. I think that's everything I have. I'm going to turn this over to you, Susan.
Hey, thank you, Lisa. And thanks to all of you for deciding that you're going to take 2 hours out of very busy days to join us for this very important topic. Hopefully, I don't need to convince you that we're going to try to share information that should make doing your jobs easier, make you feel more effective, help you reach more families and little kiddos who need your support. Because you've made that choice to be here, and Lisa and I are both very grateful about that. I guess I should have said I'm Susan Bashinsky, but you figured that out from what Lisa said. I live in Kansas City, Missouri. I first met Lisa almost 20 years ago when we worked on a deaf-blind research project together. I'm a special ed teacher. I'm a university professor, now retired. Yay. Sorry, I have to have a little personal celebration for a moment. I've worked in the field of special ed and specifically with learners who experience severe disabilities and or deaf blindness for the last almost 40 years. So I'll try to share with you some things from my own experience, as well as from my research, as well as from classes I've taken, classes I've taught. And hopefully you will find it useful. I taught for almost a decade in the public schools before I moved to university. My youngest learner, and this is what got me into the field of deaf blindness, to tell you the truth, I was teaching in a public school and the principal came and told me I was going to have a new student. I said, great. And I said, what's his name? Todd. Okay, great. And how old is he? He is, when he comes to school, he will be 6 weeks old. What? What? He's 6 weeks old? Okay. Well, he's deaf-blind. What? That hadn't worked with kids with deaf blindness before that. And boy, I started reading and I started panicking, and his mom walked, and I was not a mother at that time. I'd done a lot of babysitting, but 6 weeks, really? Okay. And I taught in a junior high school. You need to remember that part. And the mom walks in and goes, "Here." Okay, thank you very much. And it was like, "Oh, Susan, you have so much to learn." And I got hooked with Todd and his mom and his family. And I've been working with deafblindness ever since. I've taught learners who are burdened with every label under the sun, every SPED label. Yeah, been there, done that with the kids, but severe disabilities and deafblindness has always been my favorite. So hopefully I'll have some stories from those experiences to share with you, in addition to the Todd story that was just the freak out of the world. A couple of things logistically, and then we'll get started with content. Lisa did send all of the handouts and slides to you. Thank you, Lisa, for doing that. And I would just ask, I am absolutely fine with your sharing that material, sharing ideas from those materials with your colleagues, with families. I'm fine with it. But I would ask two favors of you, please. If you do decide to share those materials with anyone, please, first of all, keep the Indiana State Project's name associated with them, because Lisa and her project in your state have come up with the funding and the arrangements to make it possible for me to do this work with you. And they need to be recognized for that. And if you're sharing those materials with anyone, those new folks need to know about the Indiana Deafblind Project, right? So please keep the project's name associated with the materials. Secondly, again, I want, if they help, great. But I would ask that you please keep my name associated with the materials too, if there's some of the handouts that I've made, the slide deck and many of the handouts. I think 5 of the handouts, 6 of them I made. Because again, I do some work like this, and if I'm working for someone and I'm using recycling some of the materials, I don't want somebody to say, "What are you doing, Susan? We're paying you to share materials that came out of Indiana." It's like, no, that was my stuff. So just keep our names associated with it, and, go forth and conquer the world with it. As Lisa explained, please, as I go, put questions in the chat box. If there's a word I use or something that needs to be clarified right away, please put it in the chat box with kind of like an exclamation, urgent. And Lisa, you can interrupt me with those questions. Because if somebody needs something clarified before we go on, I want to do that. We will have 4 opportunities where I'll stop and we'll say, what questions do we have, Lisa? 3 of them will be through the course of our talk together, and then 1 at the end, and we'll try to open it up for live questions at the end if we have 10 or so minutes left. So that's the plan. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work, and we will get going. If somebody could tell me, whoa, if you can see my slides, I would sure appreciate it. Do you see my slides? Somebody?
Yeah, they're there, Susan.
Okay, sometimes that doesn't always work and I'm panicked. Okay, so early identification, here we go. This is for me. I would really like it. I've been looking at the names as you've come in from the waiting room, and a few people have said like early interventionist, those kinds of things, but I would love the opportunity to meet all of you. I can't. So if you'd put your first name and say, I'm a PT, or I'm a mom, or I'm a SPED teacher, or a PE teacher, or whatever your role is, just if you'd put that in there so I can take a glance and see who we have here today, that'd make me really happy. And thank you. I'm trying to open the chat so I can watch it as we go. How about that? Oh, here they come. Thank you. Lots of first steps, people. Graduate students, SLP, excellent. I'll keep looking at these as we go. Thank you for doing this for me and indulging me. So here we go. We'll look quickly at what I hope to share with you today. the rationale, why the early identification of kids who have deaf blindness is so critical. Again, I don't think I need to lecture you about that because you think it's important or you wouldn't be here. We'll talk about the stats. Every year, the National Center on Deaf Blindness conducts a census. Maybe you know that, maybe some of you don't, because as I look, a lot of you have experience with kids with deaf blindness. All of you I see so far have early childhood experience, but maybe you're not aware of deaf blindness, so you might not know that. We'll look at the national stats and the Indiana stats. There's something I think is very interesting in there. We'll talk very briefly about the early development of vision, ability and skill, hearing development. What is typical to expect? We have to have that as a guidepost with what is typical so we can look and assess what may be different, what may be lacking, what may be exaggerated, and what one of your little kiddos is doing. A lot of this, I'm going to defer to some handouts I provided for you, but we will talk about it briefly. We'll talk about newborn hearing screening. We will talk about general best practices for early assessment. We'll have a brief discussion of what authentic assessment means. Most of this, I think, will be familiar to you, but we're going to do it as a review so we have a common language as we go forward with the rest of the session. A big focus of the session is on child-guided assessment, which is like the gold standard in deaf blindness. It is an approach we'll talk about today. And it has 10 areas at which we need to look. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about each of the 10. We'll spend a lot of time there. And then very briefly, we'll talk about some formal assessment instruments for early childhood. We'll really look hard at one, and then I'll make mention of some others for you. So hopefully 2:30, you'll think we did this, or we did most of it, fingers crossed. So let's get going. And thank you for populating the chat. That's when I look this direction, I'm looking at the chat, and I really appreciate it. We've got some directors of early childhood, lots of first step service coordinators, speech paths. Awesome. I really appreciate that. The first handout to which I'll call your attention is I did provide an action plan. You don't have to turn this into Lisa. You don't have to turn it into me. But I'm hoping, now I'm projecting, okay? I'm projecting and saying, well, when I go to a workshop or take a class, I sit and I listen, I go, oh, I want to do that with Johnny. Oh, I want to do that with Todd. Oh, I want to do that with Linda's dad. And then if I don't write it down, I go back and I think, I was going to do something. What was it? Write it down. Write down your thoughts about what you might want to do. If there's a certain resource you want to look up, if there's something about which you want to talk with an audiologist, if you want to talk to the 5th grade teacher. No, you don't do that. Your early childhood. Come on, Susan, get your head in the game. You want to talk with the on-site preschool teacher, write it down. Nobody's going to check on you. It's just like forced note-taking, if you'll allow me to say that. Okay. Forced note-taking. And this is a caveat that sort of will launch us into the specific content. I think it's so hard for me, after having worked in this field for so long, to say, what's the most important thing to remember? And I really can't do that, but I can get it down to about 3. And this is one of them. So the other 2 are scattered throughout the presentation today. I got to have a chance to say each one of them, right? But a child with deaf blindness is not a child with hearing loss, or somebody may say a child is deaf who can't see. Similarly, a child with deaf blindness is not a child who's blind or a child who has vision loss but can't hear. It's different than that. There's a synergistic effect when the sensory losses are dual and they come together, and they have an exponential effect on development. They have an exponential effect on learning. They really produce a situation that needs different considerations. Now, not 100%, like some of the things you do with a child who's blind will be effective with a child who has deafblindness, but not in and of themselves, more than likely. You got to do something in addition to that, because deafblindness is unique. Deafblindness is an incredibly complex disability. And although we draw from the field of vision loss and TVIs, I haven't noticed any TVIs, but I also haven't read the whole list yet. I'm trying to do that. Or teachers of the deaf, you'll draw from their skill set, but there are things we need to do with kids who have deafblindness or are suspected of having deafblindness that are unique. And we'll try to talk about those things. So let's talk about early identification, okay? These are quotes from, you'll see at the bottom right, NCDB. That's the National Center on Deafblindness. If you are aware of them, fantastic. If you are not aware of them, that would be one thing I would love to see written on your action plan sheets, is to check out NCDB. It's a site with a lot of information, lots of resources. I'll reference you to a couple things in particular, lots of videos, lots of training opportunities, just lots of information. And it's all free. So take advantage of that. I like what they tell us here, and I think it sets the stage beautifully for what we're doing today, that experiences during the earliest years of life have a profound influence on a child's ability to learn, move, and interact with others. And my guess is, looking at this list of all of you early childhood experts, first steps experts, you're going, yes, that's why I do the job I do, because the earliest years of life have a profound influence on everything that comes later. Yes, exactly. But this is especially true for young children who experience deafblindness, because physical development, communication development, cognitive development, emotional development, social development, all those domains are interrelated and intertwined. And when you have these sensory losses impacting learning, impacting living, impacting everything that's going on in the environment, it has this effect of spreading into all of these other developmental domains, and the kids get behind the 8 ball so early, and we have so much to do to try to support them and help them catch up and keep up. Deafblindness is especially impactful because of environmental access. And if you haven't worked much in the field of deafblindness, you will hear these terms a lot. Environmental access, accessibility, everything that we do, it's like it's so obvious in the environment now. When we walk out, there are curb cuts everywhere. There are handicapped parking spaces everywhere. That's all about accessibility, isn't it? That's about accessibility for people who have physical disabilities, motor disabilities, right? And it's easy to see because their physical disability is directly observable. If they can't walk and they use a wheelchair, if they drive a modified car with a lift, all those kind of things, you can see the minute you set eyes on them, they need something different. It would be lovely if, when we worked with a little one from birth to 3, birth to 5, that if they needed something different from us because of inability to access the environment, you know, if they had signs on them that told us what they needed, it would be so much easier, but they don't. We can see evidence of their sensory losses, but we don't immediately be reminded all the time. Maybe they have a hearing aid, maybe they have a cochlear, but we need to think about access all the time. Always think about access. It's very, very important, because in the field of deafblindness, we talk about distance senses and we talk about contact senses. And these are defined just exactly as you would define those words as you use them in a conversation with your friends. Distance senses, there are, of the 5 main senses, I'm not talking about proprioception, vestibular, I'm not talking about those. but the ones that you learned in kindergarten about the 5 main senses, right? Okay, 3 of those are distance senses. And that means that through that sensory channel, you can pick up and gather information from other people, from the environment that are removed from your physical self space, right? Your vision, you can see vision as far, far away from you. You can hear things far, far away from you. And you can smell things far away from you. You know, that whole thing about anybody ever walked into a room after somebody burns popcorn in a microwave, right? You can smell that. Sometimes you don't even have to walk in the room. Those are our 3 distant senses: vision, hearing, smell. Well, kids with deaf blindness, they take a hit, and it could be minor to severe to very profound in vision and hearing, and they don't have to be the same, right? It could be a mild hearing loss, severe vision loss, or vice versa. 2 of those 3. And as early childhood specialists, you do teaching all the time. You do lesson planning all the time. You know, it's really hard. I think it's really hard, so I'm projecting onto you. It's really hard to build lessons completely around smell. You can have different activities with smell, but boy, to do all the teaching you need to do with just smell, that's a tough challenge, right? So, wow, you know, we cannot rely solely on smell to teach kids everything that we want them to know. So we have to rely on those contact senses. And that means that to learn from that sensory channel or those sensory channels, you have to have direct contact. Well, what are they? Taste or gustatory, right? You have to have it in your mouth, you have to have it right here in contact with your body, or touch, which by its very definition is in contact. And again, especially for kids with deaf blindness, touch can be an incredibly powerful learning channel, but it's contact. So we limit the scope of the world from all of these things that you can see here. It pulls in to just this little circle, this bubble that surrounds the child. And I think that if we can remember this and take this as our mindset, you know, kids can access what's right here. It might make a difference in how we do what we do. And this is probably, Susan, you don't even need to say it, that if we do identify these children with deaf blindness early, there's a very positive correlation with a reduction of negative impacts in the future, because we've increased environmental access and increased that child's ability to gain meaningful information from the environment. And that's what learning is all about, right? I think especially in early childhood, in my opinion, all of you guys do a much better job as a group than special ed school age teachers, elementary, secondary, do in terms of enhancing the environment and teaching the whole child. You do such a beautiful job as a group of looking at the environment, and you want to set up your environment so kids can gather as much meaningful information as possible. So let's take a look at the statistics. Sorry, I thought I had my phone muted. I didn't. All right. As I said, when I gave you the introduction of our learning targets for today, the National Center on Deaf Blindness conducts this child count every year. And the most current stats that we have to report to you today are those from 2022. It's reported from January 1st through December 31st. And so the 2023 numbers aren't compiled and published yet. Lisa told me she's just finished working on those for Indiana. So I realize the numbers I'm sharing with you are from 2022. And nationally, in 2022, there were 10,441 kids that were served with a deaf blindness label. Just over 250 in Indiana. I've got that number someplace else. But the main thing that we are focused on today with this early identification charge is that less than 6% of the children on the national count were in that category of birth through 2 years of age. It actually was 5.2%, birth through 2, okay? And approximately 20% of those kiddos were identified as high risk, and nearly all of them received some sort of home-based services already. All right, now, moving on. There's the number. Okay, I was a little high. It's 224 in Indiana. I apologize. So what about Indiana? During that same year, 2022, of the 10,441 nationally, Indiana provided support services to 224 individuals who experienced deafblindness. This is birth through 21, okay? You might say, Susan, we're talking about little bitties. I know, but I want you to have this full picture of what Lisa and her project are charged with doing. They serve 224 individuals. So I ask you, how many of those were young children between the ages of birth and 2? All right. So for reference, nationally, 5.2% of the full census count was birth to 2. What do you think's going on in Indiana? And for those of you who finished the pretest, that's one of the questions on the pretest, right? So heads up, we're going to give you the answer for the post-test right now. All right. I think this is powerful. In the 2022 census, in Indiana, the far right-hand column is Indiana, birth to 2, which is our primary focus for today, Indiana served 2 kids, identified and served 2 kids, 2 out of 224, which is a whopping percentage of 0.89%. And I hope you think about that for a minute. Please understand, folks, I'm not trying to beat anybody over the head and say, shame, shame, everybody knows your name. This isn't a good thing. You know we need to do better. That's why you're here, right? Lisa knows we need to do better. That's why she talked to me about this. But I think it's this comparison that nationally, 5.2% of the census was birth to 2. In Indiana, 0.89 of your state census was birth to 2. And so we need to fix it. Lisa, I'm going to come to you for a comment in just 1 minute, so you might get yourself prepared. Then look here what happens with 3 to 5. The national census is reported in all of these striated age divisions, right? And the next one is 3 to 5 years. Well, nationally, in the 3 to 5 year range, it was 11.4% of the national census. And look what Indiana does. You guys just are rocking it. You really catch up. By then, you're at 11.2. This is very close to matching what's going on nationally. So what that says to me is you guys in Indiana really are boogieing. And some of you early childhood folks are just knocking the top off with getting kids identified and get them services by the time they hit in this 3 to 5 year old range. But what we're trying to do is clean this up and raise that level of service. Lisa, could you say something and share with this group, please, about your processes and referral and what ideas you have about how we might improve this for your state?
So there's a couple of things. One is that this is not just 2022. This is a pattern. It's never actually been higher than, say, a 10 or so. And for years we struggled in that kind of 2 to 6 range, right? There are some differences if a child is in the public school system. The way things work here is that with the FERPA regs that we have that apply to the project, public school personnel can report and give me all of the information on that student directly. It's no problem. They just share it with me as if I were another school. And that does make it a little easier for those folks. So that may be part of the reason that the 3 to 5 year old is a little higher. For the folks who are serving kiddos in First Steps, it's never been as clear that you could share that information with me directly unless you just had the parent right there who said, yes, I'm going to sign this waiver, and you send it to them. So there is two different forms on our website, and one of them is the actual reporting form where you fill out all the information and I get everything I need on that child and that family. The other one is a referral form, which we developed specifically for First Steps personnel, where if you didn't feel comfortable, didn't have the appropriate paperwork, didn't think you were able to report that child directly, you can fill out contact information and who you are and say, can you follow up with the family and see if they want to report their child? And we can do that as well. It just is a little more complicated, a couple more steps for the younger kids.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. And that was a quick introduction to some really important information, but check out the Indiana Deafblind Project website and contact Lisa if you have questions, and we're gonna target this. You're here, so congrats to you. We're going to talk about one more section of information in the slides, and then we'll see if we have some questions. I do want to talk with you a little bit about early development of vision, early development of hearing. And in some respects, I'm sure those of you in this crowd have more information about this than I do. And so, you know, if you have something you want to add to what I'm sharing, please put it in the chat, because after this section, we will have some questions. You have two handouts, and I'll reference those as we go, that have to do with this information. We're going to look through a table about what's reasonable to expect in terms of vision development. And I have created a summary table for you that is taken from the next 4 slides we'll examine together. And what I have done in that table was I tried to highlight and break out like how focus changes from each of these 4 age groups: birth to 1 month, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 7. All the focus is across, and some of the columns are blank. How about tracking and how that goes across? Whereas on these slides, it's just all crammed in together without the comparison across columns, because I just don't have enough space. So I think in some respects, the handout is clearer than the slides, but I wanted to highlight this because I think for those of you who work speech paths, I noticed we have an OT, that's great. Your general ed colleagues, if they're early childhood specialists, they should be like you, or if they're early childhood special ed specialists, there's a mouthful, they should be like you and have an awareness of very, very early development. And yet sometimes I think if we are not working with kids birth to 2, because we're not special ed in our focus and those kids don't come to school that early, we maybe don't realize what goes on in terms of very, very early development. And you know that little bitty babies, they stare at bright light and they blink when the light's too bright. Well, you go, duh, it hurts their eyes, okay? But they will briefly look at a person's face. As you go to the next column, you see that, okay, the child is beginning to shift gaze, all right? And eye contact is beginning to increase. You might say to me, what's with these colors? I'm just trying to separate them out because the slides are crowded, and I know they're crowded. The color doesn't mean anything other than this is one, this is the next one, this is the next one. And as you go across these columns, you can see what goes on. The focus depth, the focus distance, that's probably a better word, changes across columns, and you can watch how that pattern emerges. And on your table, focus is all on the same line, all right? You can see how you start to see, whereas 1 to 3 months, there's some tracking, but by the time you get into 3-5 month range, kids can reverse direction in their tracking. And that's a huge, huge skill for learning from the environment. at this age, kids start to look for a caregiver in a group. Babies will start to look for that familiar face, right? I don't need to tell you that, yeah, they little kids that in the 3 to 5 month range, anything they can grab, they look at it and put it in their mouth. You know that. But I think, so I tried to include some of those kinds of things as a summary for you, but I also try to put in some of these key things of when kids start to look for their caregiver. And now by 5 to 7 months, kids will visually discriminate strangers with some emotion, all right? And I think this helps explain, if you haven't studied the birth to one visual skills development, you know, people will say, oh, the baby's so happy, he'll just go to anybody and he smiles and laughs and he'll just let anybody hold him. And yeah, it's because he hasn't gotten to the point that he discriminates the strangers yet. And then when he hits 6 months or 7 months, it's like, whoa, somebody takes him and he looks at that person and goes, you're not my mom, so I'm going to cry now. And it's just part of the developmental pattern. And I think that I've tried to pick out, there's a whole lot more, of course, but I've tried to pick out some of the key points that tell us what is going on. And already you can see that by 7 months of age, with a child, a baby who is born blind, or with a very severe vision impairment, look at all the things on which they're behind. Look at all the things that they've missed out on by the time they're 6 or 7 months old. And we have a lot of compensation to do, and it gets tricky. And one of the things we'll talk about, we have a follow-up webinar in 2 weeks. It's the actual intervention piece. It's really tricky. We can't say necessarily we can get in there and start compensating and teaching in different ways for the skills this baby is missing because he can't see, because he may be so sick he's in a NICU for 6 months. And you know, if you've got a really sick baby, yes, visual development is important, but keeping the baby alive is more important. And so, you know, visual development, hearing development, language development, those things have to take a back seat to getting the congenital heart problems fixed and the lungs fixed and the infection and the whatever is going on that's challenging that baby's ability to survive. So a lot of this kind of stuff is going on when babies who are very, very ill at birth, and lots of kids with deafblindness are. We'll look at that in a little bit. Not all, okay? Not all kids born with congenital deafblindness are very sickly, but many, many are. So it's another thing I hope you will keep in mind, that a lot of this development is supposed to be happening when kids are fighting for their lives and they're receiving a lot of medical care. And so we have to take a back seat with what we do. And that's tricky. So you have the vision chart. Similarly, you have a chart. And I want to go through this just a little bit with you. It's the second handout that I referenced for this section. It's basically set up like the vision one. It goes across the tables, but whereas mine is all smashed vertically to get it on each slide, yours is striated out across the column. So if you read straight across, you're seeing what happens with sound awareness across development from birth. And these months are different. You notice this is birth to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to 12, and then the second year of life. So this hearing range is different than the vision. And there's something behind that too, about so much early vision development happens by 7 months of age. Hearing keeps going and going and going, as does vision, but it's much more important and breaks out through 24 months of age. But you can read across the columns. And most of this is stuff that you could tell me. You don't need me to tell you, but you start seeing, and this matches what we had with vision, right? That as kids begin to discriminate a caregiver visually in the 5-6 month range, by the time they hit 6 months, they can respond and do respond to the primary caregivers. So they complement each other. When their name is called, they will begin to turn to look. They'll start to turn their bodies toward an interesting sound. You start seeing sound localization from only with their name to things that are interesting or searching for a new sound. So you see sound awareness, sound localization. You start seeing sound linguistic comprehension coming in, production as they experiment with sounds. And so you can read across the columns on the handout. And I hope you'll have that as a guide to, it's a crude guide, but maybe it will help you as you're assessing these little bitty kids. You'll start to hear a true word by 24 months of age, pairing two words together, and so on and so forth. So you have those handouts. Before we take a look at congenital hearing loss, I want to stop. You've been listening to me for a long time, and I know that's kind of boring, and I apologize for that, but it's this foundational information, so bear with me, please. Hopefully it'll get a little bit more exciting. Lisa, what questions do you have in the chat? I'm not seeing any, but maybe
Yeah, I don't see anything so far.
we'll stop because we have a couple of minutes. Does anybody have a comment? Do you have a question you haven't put in the chat yet that you want to stick in there right now, or should we just charge ahead? Let's take a few seconds, Lisa, and see if anybody populates the chat with anything.
Okay.
Hi, I have a question. I'm Kirby, I'm an OT. If we refer one of our kiddos to the state institute you were talking about, what services do they get from that, or does it just help with the reporting?
Okay, that's for me. Kirby, what we do is we can provide technical assistance and training. So more things like this for you guys, or I can come and visit, do an observation with the kiddo and help provide strategies specific to that child for you and the family. We also have family events that they would then be able to participate in. And usually things for families are completely free. A lot of our trainings are free. Sometimes if it's in person, there's a small fee attached to it for service providers. So a lot of training, a lot of technical assistance, resource information, and then family activities.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Kirby, for your question. I think that really is important because maybe for those of you who don't have experience in the field of deafblindness, this national center sort of coordinates the work of all the deafblind projects. There is a deafblind project that serves every state in the United States, as well as Puerto Rico and some of the territories. But generally speaking, the projects, such as Lisa's project in Indiana, they don't provide direct services. They support the family. So they support the child through the family channel, as Lisa explained. They support the child through support for the school team or the early childhood team or the other service providers that are working with the child, because the state deafblind projects aren't funded as direct service providers. Fair enough, Lisa?
Perfect. We do have another question too.
Yeah.
It says, are the number of students with deafblindness increasing over the years?
That's a very interesting question, Christine, and I appreciate it. For the most part, I would say nationally, it's pretty stable. We've been in the approximate range of 10,000, 10,500 for over the last decade. I know I can say that with assurance. I don't remember the numbers prior to that. So it'll go up by 100 or 50, or it'll go down. But for the most part, we're around the 10,000 figure. If I had to say what the trend is a slight increase, but nothing significant. That's nationally. Lisa, what's going on with Indiana? Do you want to make a quick comment before we go on?
I have a couple of things. One is that we did have a pretty significant jump this year, but we've stayed in that 220 to 230 range for a while. But I do want to point out, so kids cycle off of the census as well. So we're losing kids every year. Because they're either too old, or unfortunately some of them may die, or a variety of reasons. So we typically lose anywhere from 15 to 25 a year. So there is still a significant amount that are being reported. What I do see is some changes in who's being reported, because we have a lot more kids with CVI being reported. We have a lot more students who have multiple disabilities being reported, and appropriately so. It's just a difference in who, I think, more than anything.
Thank you, Lisa. That prompts a thought that I want to share, and I have some data about this, but I'll be honest with you, a lot of what is going to talk right now is Susan Bashinsky's gut, okay? And Lisa, you're welcome to agree with me or disagree with me. I just get so tickled sometimes, and not in a good way. It's like, it's ludicrous to me that we have fairly high numbers of kids, and I'm talking now birth to 21, that whole range that the national census covers, okay? That are classified as having severe disabilities or multiple disabilities, okay? But that's their categorization, and they don't get services for deafblind. They're not marked, they're not referred as eligible for deafblindness. Okay. And I'm not saying, please don't leave this and say, oh, Susan Bashinsky said that every kid who has multiple disabilities has deafblindness. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. But I am suggesting to you that, hey, these kids that have very significant brain damage because of a genetic disorder or a chromosomal disorder or a metabolic disorder or who knows what, and it is severe enough that it impacts their cognition and their motor ability and their social ability. And do we think then that it just separates out their brain and it doesn't impact their vision and it doesn't impact their hearing? I don't think so. I personally believe that if the brain trauma has been significant enough that it impacts functioning in all those other areas, I think the chances are pretty good that there is some impact on hearing and some impact on vision. Lisa, am I crazy, or do you believe that's true also?
I actually agree with you, and I would like to add, in Indiana, our definition of deafblindness does have a specified functional component. So if that child functions in the environment as if they have a vision and hearing loss, they do still qualify.
That's so important for you to share. Thank you. So
The other piece too, I'm sorry, the other piece too is that for purposes of being registered with the project and for receiving our services, it does not matter what that child is identified on an IEP or an IFSP. As long as they fulfill that definition, it can be a second condition, a third, or not even listed.
that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And that tells me that Indiana is much less restrictive than some states, and I applaud you for this, that, you know, it may be that a little child, a toddler, an infant, and this is trickier when you're talking about a little bitty fella than if you're talking about a 3 or 4-year-old, but Lisa mentioned CVI. For those of you, that's cortical visual impairment, whereas there isn't necessarily an acuity loss or a peripheral field loss or other field loss in the vision, but there's something going on with the central processing of visual information. That qualifies as a visual disability. On the hearing side, AN, auditory neuropathy, central auditory processing disorder, that's a mouthful, CAPD. Those will, again, there's not a measure on an audiogram that the hearing is deficient or lacking. There's something going on with the processing in the brain, so kids function in the environment as though they are not using auditory information well. And so that CVI, CAPD, kids will qualify for deafblindness if they have those visual or auditory conditions as well. So we've got a wider net that's sweeping through Indiana and giving you support for your services for these kiddos and their families. So Lisa, thank you for that. Okay, Are we ready to move on? I didn't see any more.
We got one other quick question that I can answer. So Joy asked if they have to be registered to gain access to the services and resources. Are there geographical restrictions, and about our website? So yes, they must be reported to our census to receive the services and resources. That's strictly just because I have to report those kids, and that tells everybody, including my OSEP project officer, that they qualify for the services. No, it's Indiana specific, but we do the entire state. So anywhere in Indiana, they qualify to receive our services. So there's no geographic restrictions. And it looks like you've gone to the Bloomberg Center to look for a website, and you can reach our website through that location. There are two projects that work with deaf and hard of hearing and vision impairments, and then deaf blindness on Bloomberg's website. One's called the PASS Project. They primarily do training for teachers of the deaf and teachers of the visually impaired. And then my project. To keep it simple, our website is actually indbservices.org. You can get there directly. I'll put it in the chat box for everybody.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you. Good questions, folks. We appreciate it. All right. Next chunk. We want to look at how we identify congenital hearing loss. In this section, or related to this section, you do have one handout that I copied for you. It's not one that I created. That is a comparison of the two major tests used to assess newborns' hearing. So you know that you have that. And it is a comparison of these two approaches that we're going to discuss. So in terms of newborn hearing screening, we'll start in the middle of the slide. Universal hearing screening is now required by law in all 50 states. Thank goodness. This has not been something that has been the case forever and ever. The last few states only came on within the last 5 years, but now every single baby that's born in the United States has to have a hearing screening. And that's because of what we've said, that hearing is so critical to future development, and most especially critical to communication and language development. And it's invisible, right? And if you look at the hearing chart, there's a lot of things babies do in those first few months of life. They don't respond to sounds as we do. So we don't know if they're hearing them, that the sound is being conducted to their brains or not, because it's invisible and we can't see it. And so we have to get in there and we have to get these testing results, all right? Because 95% of children ultimately identified as having hearing loss as they get into the 3 to 5 preschool age and on into elementary and secondary school. 95% of those kids are identified at birth. That's powerful, okay? That's powerful. So we have to keep this up. Hearing loss is the #1 disability present at birth in the United States, okay? The American Association of Pediatrics is the AAP. They estimate 2 to 3 of every 1,000 births. The American Association of Audiology, AAA, estimates 3 to 6 per 1,000. You've got some numbers. I don't get hung up on the specifics of the numbers, but the pediatricians, the audiologists know that we've got needs. And because hearing loss is the #1 disability present at birth, we have something we can do about it. We need to do it, thank goodness. But there are things you need to know about it. And some of this, I didn't pick up that we have an audiologist here. And if I missed that in the chat, I apologize. You as speech paths and OTs and directors and early interventionists won't be doing this screening, but chances are you may field questions from the kid's family about the screening. So I'm hopeful that some of this may give you a little bit more information than you had before, and that there's not just this black hole somewhere where the screening happens and you don't know about it and then you read a report, right? newborn, because that's how I was when I was a teacher in the classroom. I didn't know what I should have known. So sometimes some of what I'm sharing with you is me going, huh, I wish somebody would have told me that, because Todd's mother asked me and I didn't know how to answer the question. So I had to go find it. Okay. A newborn hearing screening will take 5 to 10 minutes. All right. 1 to 2% of all babies do not pass that initial screening. All right. But that doesn't mean that child necessarily has a hearing loss. We'll talk about that. It's just they didn't pass the first screening. So it's like they put the red flag up the flagpole to say, follow, retest, maybe there is a loss. But this is much more significant. It's a much higher number than this 2 to 3 per thousand or the 3 to 6 per thousand, right? This is like 100 to 200. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. But the screening is so important because identification allows kids to be fit with hearing aids early. I've seen some of the tiniest, smallest hearing aids on babies. And there's different kinds of aids. There are bone conduction aids, as well as the kind of aids that you're used to seeing. It also allows families to consider and opt for cochlear implants. And now I've read that many infants are being fitted with cochlear implants well under the 12 months of age. I read about a baby that was implanted at 5 months. So we get these options so kids' brains aren't starved of that auditory input for an extended period of time. More information is good for families and teams, right? So what about Indiana? All right. You guys weren't one of the stragglers. Yay, Indiana. That's fantastic. A universal newborn hearing screening program was implemented in your state July 1st of 2000. So 24 years ago, you guys got on board with this. And I'm sure that some of the kids that have been identified in Indiana as having deaf blindness were identified as having hearing loss when this screening was implemented. All right. And here's what we have to do. And this, I'm sure, is stuff that Lisa can fill you in on for your state as well, because this isn't a part that's going to be your responsibility to do, but it may be that as an early interventionist working with the family, you can prompt families to follow up if there's a need here. Remember, we said that approximately 1 to 2% of babies fail the newborn hearing screening. All right. If they do in your state, and you say, well, this is true everywhere. No, it's not. States are different. In your state, an infant who does not pass the newborn hearing screening should have a follow-up diagnostic assessment prior to 3 months. Again, get in there early. If there's really a loss, let's find it. Let's identify it. And if then they have this diagnostic and pass, yay, everything's good, right? That's what we want, all right? But if they fail a newborn hearing screening, they need an audiological diagnostic prior to 3 months. Well, this is where I think if you're an early interventionist working with a family in the home, you can talk to them and find out, what do you know about your son's results from the newborn hearing screening? And if they don't know, then you can help them find out, right? Especially if you suspect that baby or a toddler, and you might be working with a kid who's 15 months old, and you go, well, that's not meeting this. Well, no, it's not. But if you're watching a 15-month-old and you don't know what was happening as a result of the newborn hearing screening, follow up at 15 months is better than follow up when he's in kindergarten, right? So you're gonna say, well, what were the results of his hearing screening? And if mom says, oh, he flunked that, but he didn't pass, we were supposed to go back, and you can prompt them. You guys know how to work with families. You're experts at that. That's what your First Steps program teaches you and supports you to do, right? And so you can urge them. Well, has he had that reassessment? Did you have that diagnostic? Did you take him back? No, we got too busy. And sometimes that's real, right? If they have other kids, if the baby or toddler is really sick, other medical stuff, you don't know. And so you encourage, you try to find out, you try to help the family set that up. You know, well, I'm happy to help you try to get that in place, and just know, and that's why I think it's important, you know, that for a child who does not pass newborn hearing screening, there is state law that says you're supposed to have a diagnostic prior to 3 months. And keep reading. In your state, infants identified with a permanent hearing loss are required or should be, and again, how is it enforced? There's the tricky part, right? But they are supposed to be enrolled in early intervention prior to 6 months of age. Now, I was using this example of a 15-month-old. That's because I was working with a family, and my story about the child was 15 months, and I just honestly thought he was functioning like he didn't hear much. He didn't hear well. I thought I saw things going on with his vision. And I was trying to talk, and he had failed the newborn hearing screening, and mom had never taken him back. And it was in a different state. So these actual month targets were different, but I tried to work with that family to get him back in. And we finally got him back in about 16 months of age. He had a profound hearing loss. We worked with the family. We supported them to get some aids in place, to get hearing services of a deaf ed person, and it changed the trajectory of that little one's life. So I hope that having these numbers might be of help to you. So we're going to talk about 2 different tests for newborn hearing screening. One is the autoacoustic emissions. The second is the automated auditory brainstem response. Both big mouthfuls. And you won't do these. And I know you won't do these, but I think it's important that you have some understanding of what they are and how they're done. And so if a mom, said, well, I didn't take him back for that test because my baby's only 5 months old and I don't want them to hurt him. Well, if you can explain to a family that when you have an OAE, you'll see that a lot more often, in my experience anyway, than you'll see autoacoustic emissions. People just write OAE, but this is what it stands for, autoacoustic emissions. And if you can say, no, let's talk about that test, to assure them it doesn't hurt their baby, nothing is wrong, and how it happens, you can ease parents' minds and take the stress off of them. Because if they have a baby that might not, a toddler that might not be developing as expected, as is typical, they're stressed, they're worried, they're scared. So if we can allay some of those fears, it's going to be helpful. So for an OAE test, it measures responses coming from the inner ear, from the cochlea in the inner ear. They just take this tiny little probe right here and they just put it in the baby's ear canal. And you can see it can be done when the baby's sleeping, which is a good thing because a lot of these newborn babies, they sleep a lot. So they take this tiny probe, they put it in the ear canal, and the probe measures the echo when clicks or tones are played into the baby's ears. There's an echo that comes back from the cochlea in the inner ear. We don't have to understand the details of it. We don't do the test, but you can help parents understand it doesn't hurt their baby. It can be done when the baby's asleep. It only takes a few minutes. They just put this in the baby's ear. They play clicks, they play tones, and a different machine records what the response is. If the echo comes back as the eardrum receives input from the cochlea, then we know that that part of the inner ear is functioning appropriately. All right. And so that's an OAE test. The OAE requires less time than the second one. We're going to talk about the AABR next. I think it's easier to use OAE and AABR because the words are just cumbersome. OAEs are typically less expensive. In my experience, most hospitals with the majority of kids, when they're just testing all the kids, they'll run an OAE test first because it's quicker and it's cheaper. All right. Then if they have some concerns, sometimes they'll turn around and then they will do a second test with the AABR, which you're going to talk about in a minute. Can't talk about them both at the same time. All right. So let's talk about the OAE. As we said, when I was explaining with the picture, the OAE is utilized to gain information about how the infant's cochlea is functioning, all right? And this is that part of the inner ear that has rows of hair cells, outer hair cells, inner hair cells, and the cochlea is like a snail shell, right? And when those hair cells receive sound, they vibrate and it echoes back to the middle ear, all right? This is critical because this is the kind of information medical folks use, and this has to do with how cochlear implants can facilitate hearing loss, all right? An OAE test is especially effective for identifying hearing loss in the 2 to 4 kilohertz range. If you don't know what that is, that's okay. You can look at an audiogram to see where a kid's loss might be, if there's identified loss. If you don't know what that means, that's fine. You don't have to know what that means. Pair up with your school's audiologist. They can help you understand that. And then if you're getting into detailed conversations with a family, you would want, I believe, to partner with an audiologist to have that conversation with the family anyway, because if you're an early childhood special ed specialist like I was, or an early childhood interventionist, we don't have the depth of knowledge to answer all the questions a family might ask. So partner with other members of your team. The OAE is an excellent screening tool from birth to 3 years of age. That's why I say that 15-month-old, the family I worked with, we could still use that test, because when you're working with little bitty kids, 12 months, 15 months, 18 months, they can't reliably do the sound booth test that we do, right? When they say, when you hear a tone, raise your hand. They can't do that. So you can not do it reliably anyway. They'll just be raising their hand all the time if they think it's fun. Okay. And kids with physical disabilities, they can't do that anyway. So the OAE is effective to 3 years of age, and it measures the function of the hair cells in the cochlea, those little bitty hair cells in that snail thing that vibrate. The OAE does not measure the functionality, the integrity of the auditory nerve. That's important, because if there's a sensory neural hearing loss, it's not going to show up on an OAE. And with kids with sensory neural hearing loss, the implication for medical treatment is very different as well. So it's important you know what the restrictions and the parameters are for this test. Okay, let's look at the second test. The second one is called the AABR, Automated Auditory Brainstem Response. Sometimes you will see this as listed ABR. And on the handout I provided for you, it compares the OAE and the ABR. That's this test, all right? ABR just stands for Auditory Brainstem Response. And when I first started working in the field, I never heard it called AABR. It was always just Auditory Brainstem Response, all right? No, those are synonyms for the same thing, all right? The AABR measures responses from the cochlea and the auditory brain stem as sound travels to the brain. So this target of assessment is different than the target of assessment with the OAE, all right? And so you've got these cute little headsets going on here. Clicks or tones are played through very soft. These are that squishy foam. It's not going to hurt the baby. And they use 3, you can only really see 1 here, but you see 3 wires. There are 3 electrodes that are placed on the baby's head that also provide information about the response from the auditory nerve and the brain. Okay, that's the AABR. So a description about that, it requires more time than the OAE. It's typically more expensive than the OAE. It's still excellent of detecting average sensory neural loss at 2 to 4 kilohertz, same range, but this has to do with a different level of volume or a different level of loudness. It's more sensitive to quieter sounds. This test is less susceptible to the status of the infant's middle ear. So if there's some suspicion that something is awry in the middle ear of the baby, either structurally, anatomically, physiologically, functionally, they will go with an AABR. And this is the very, very best test that's available for babies up to 6 months of age in terms of getting reliable assessment information for soft sounds. And that's what I was trying to say here. A 30 decibel sounds pretty quiet. The OAE doesn't pick up on the quiet sounds nearly as well as the AABR does. And this screening test reveals how the auditory nerve is functioning. And that's really important because that's a different consideration. Because if you have an auditory nerve that isn't functioning well, you could put hearing aids on a kid forever and they're not going to help because you have to have that neural integrity for a hearing aid to work. So this is the kind of stuff, again, you don't have to decide, you don't have to do the assessments, but I think it's important for you to have some understanding. So when the families have questions and the medical professionals, or they don't have access to an audiologist as often as they would like, you have to help be able to support these people with answering questions. With that, I'll add the caveat that if you get asked questions about this stuff and you don't understand, that's fine. You don't have to understand. You say to that family, as I'm sure most, if not all of you do anyway, I don't know, but I'll find out. And then you get on the phone and you get on email with Lisa and your district or program's audiologist and you get the information. Because we as teachers, right, we're the ones that have the most common, most frequent interactions with the family. I mentioned when I was talking as a follow-up to Lisa's comments that in Indiana, kids will be eligible for deafblind project services if they function as a child who doesn't see and doesn't hear in typical ways. And I mentioned auditory neuropathy, right? So that's excellent in Indiana, all right? Auditory neuropathy can really only be diagnosed if both of those tests, and here I only put ABR, so you might get used to seeing that. If ABR and OAE are completed and the results are considered together. With those results together, auditory neuropathy can be diagnosed, whereas if only one of those is given, auditory neuropathy is often missed, all right? Especially in the case of a normal, I hate that word, but normal OAE result, auditory neuropathy is often missed, and that's a problem. So, you know, if there are real concerns, you might want to talk to your audiologist and just ask questions and see if you want to advocate for follow-up with an ABR if that hasn't been done before. Now, this is probably the most technical session, the technical section of the information I have for you today. So I want to stop and start thinking about questions. I want to look at these etiologies. Lisa, thanks for your note, and see what's going on. All right. The most common etiologies that are associated with deafblindness in little bitty kids and on through the population: Charge syndrome, extreme prematurity, cytomegalovirus or CMV, Goldenhar syndrome, brain bleeds, all these kinds of things. You can get this kind of information off the census. But I mentioned this because this supports what I was insinuating when I was looking at the vision and hearing charts and saying, you know, we can't necessarily always do a lot to promote vision and hearing development with real young kids because babies are sick. Many babies with deafblindness. With Charge, it's not unusual that a kid born with Charge syndrome will spend 3-6 months in the NICU. I talked with a family last month. Their baby spent 15 months in the NICU before he ever went home. Extreme prematurity, you know enough to know extremely premature babies are going to be in NICUs, and so on and so forth. So although we have all this information of what we can do to promote hearing and vision development and assess vision and hearing development. These kids are sick. All right. So let's see if you have any question. How is a child tested for CAPD? What ages can this be detected? Pamela, that's a great question, and I don't know that I have a specific answer for you right now. I think that until, obviously, when you're talking about 6 months old, 9 months old, it's much trickier, and I think this is true because CAPD is tricky to get a handle on, in my opinion, even with elementary age kids. I would think that when you get a child who is able to do turn taking and interactions, do some object grasp, release, tracking, some of those basic sensory motor skills, you can begin to get some observational data about CAPD. My opinion is the most reliable way to get a handle on that with little bitty guys and girls is just through observational assessment and setting up tasks and seeing how they respond to different requests for, can you do this? Can you do that? If it's building, naming, signing, I can try to find something more specific if you have a more specific question. Lisa, do you have anything to add about that?
I really don't. I did want to say quickly on your etiologies in Indiana, even counting all of the kiddos that they don't know why they're deafblind, they don't have an etiology. Prematurity is our highest.
Premature.
Yeah, and if you disregard unknown, charge syndrome is the third highest.
That's interesting because this is nationally, I should have said that. So thank you for keeping me honest about that. This is the first year that charge was highest in terms of genetics and stuff. So thank you for that clarification. All right, let's look about assessment. The rest of our time, we're going to talk about assessment. CEC, I don't know if you know that. That is the Council for Exceptional Children. It is the primary professional organization for special educators in our country, and they recommend that practitioners do all these things, which I'm guessing most of you early interventionists could write. Work actively as a team, get information from the family, promote the family's competence, help them know they are competent to build on their child's strengths, that give them confidence, support their family's functioning. You say, yeah, that's how I do my job every day, Susan. Next, okay. It's important that you have some knowledge of the milestones for typical visual and auditory development. That is critical to how we find and identify young children with deafblindness. I tried to give you some of those things. I'm going to talk about a few more in child-guided assessment. I think the second point is the most important on this slide, is with the case of a child born particularly prematurely. And Lisa just gave us a really important piece of information that in Indiana, in your state, with the currently identified kiddos, prematurity is the most common cause of deafblindness, most frequently reported cause of deafblindness. All right. When you're looking at developmental milestones, it's important you calculate the baby's, toddler's age in terms of true birth age, not day born. If a baby was expected in August and was born in April, that's 4 months early, right? So you want to calculate the milestones from the August date, not the day the kid was born in April. It can give you a very different perspective. If you want, you can look at them both. But the research generally says that in cases of really premature birth, look at true birth age. And I think you will view some of your kids and their performance differently. It's also important to review medical records. I've talked about that, especially the results of newborn hearing screening. How else do we find these kiddos? I think generally be aware of the identifiable syndromes. We said extreme prematurity, charge, cytomegalovirus or CMV. There are lots of syndromic conditions. Just generally be aware of them. You don't have to know them by heart. You can look things up, talk to other people, actively solicit information from the family. Observe the kid. I think that is the most powerful tool we have, is observe that little one. Watch, listen, interact, listen, okay? And listen to medical professionals, but I would say trust your gut. You are the specialists in early development. You are the specialists who work with the families on an ongoing basis in first steps. Go with your gut. We have to be very careful and walk a fine line to not say, that pediatrician doesn't know what he's talking about. I don't advocate you do that. Please don't do that. But sometimes pediatricians, even though they're child specialists, and if you're working with all the specialists that are working with a baby with charge, you've got a cardiologist, you've got an endocrinologist, they're not specialists in child development. You are. And go with your gut and just try to schmooze with the family and say, but we see her do this. We don't see her do this. You say she does this. And give them the confidence to act on the fact they know their child the best. All right. And I think just listen to the family, talk to the family. These are things that I have heard families tell me. Well, he weighed 2.5 pounds when he was born. Red flag right now. All right. That baby might be brilliant, genius child with no disability in adulthood. Might be fine. My very best friend in the whole world weighed less than 2 pounds, and she was born a long, long time ago and does not have any remnants of disability. But many, many babies who are born with 2.5 pounds do. All right. Those sensory systems are very vulnerable. Or to hear, she spent 7 weeks in the NICU. Okay. And you don't react like I just did to you. You say, that's really important. What can you tell me about that time and what happened when she was there? And, or sometimes she seems to see things, but sometimes she doesn't. Red flags for you people. You don't act on them with the family and you don't alarm the family, but you make notes and you drill down and you ask questions, right? I've never heard of this disorder. Have you heard of Zellweger syndrome? Oh, go look it up. That's a real common paroxysmal disorder that often has deaf blindness. Okay. Or to say, he has lots of ear infections and his ears have an unusual shape, but the doctor says his hearing's fine. A mother of a baby, a little boy, wasn't a baby, was a toddler at that point, who ultimately was diagnosed with Charge syndrome, told me this. And he had the typical, if you've never seen pictures of kids with Charge, they have really unusual looking ears. Doctor says his hearing's fine. No, it wasn't. All right. So listen. Authentic assessment. What does that mean? You know this. This is just call this stuff up to the forefront of your brain. To be authentic, it needs to be reliable. We need to produce results we can get again and again. It has to be meaningful. It has to involve multiple opportunities for that baby, that child, that toddler to demonstrate a skill. It's not you get one chance to show me if you can put these things together or put something in. You get 7, right? You need repeated opportunities. You need different environmental contexts with different people. It's not a one shot. It's not a stranger come in. All right. Authentic assessment is best conducted by an individual who is familiar with the learner. Or if you are the assessor, then you do the assessment, but you have the parents or the primary caregivers or the peers or the siblings interact with the child. You can say, okay, I want you to come up behind her and do this and touch her hand, or I want you to touch her foot in this way. So you can direct the partner, but have somebody that is familiar to the kiddo do the interacting, and then you record what the child's responses are and how the child responds. Does the child take a turn? If you want to play that hand game, my hand, the sibling's hand, I mean, the child's hand, the sibling's hand, the child's hand, the sibling's hand. Don't you as the assessor do that. Have the sibling play the game and then you write what the kid does. Because learners who experience deafblindness are almost always more comfortable, less stressed, less worried, and more communicative with people they know. And I guess I would say to that, and so are most of us, aren't we? When you're doing authentic assessment, look at the appearance of the kid's eyes. Look at the appearance. If you've got stuff draining out of the kid's ears, that's a problem. Look at the eyes. Look at the general behaviors. Kids' behaviors can tell us so much. And look at the context, multiple contexts. Don't assess the child. And by context, I mean not only physical setting, but times of day. Don't always assess at 9 o'clock in the morning. Maybe assess at 1 in the afternoon and 9 in the morning. Maybe assess on a Wednesday and then on a Friday or a Monday. Mix it up because kids behave differently. I'm a very different person on Monday morning than I am on Thursday afternoon. And I think that, you know, we can say this about ourselves. Why can't we say this about the children? When you're doing assessment, when you're conducting observational assessment, if you're suspecting that a child has deafblindness, all right, remember that child's deprived of many basic motivation. The sensory input it gets is distorted. So it may not be an effective source of motivation. It may not be an effective source of information. Kids who truly have deafblindness don't benefit from being left alone with the most exciting toys in the world because they're not aware they're there in their personal space. They're bubbled in and they don't have that distance ability to reach out. One of the most well-respected sorts of assessment in the field of deafblindness is child-guided assessment, all right? And that is an assessment that was developed by Jan van Dijk in the Netherlands, and it was promoted and refined by Van Dijk and Catherine Nelson as an alternative to a traditional assessment to try to get us truer information about kids who experience deafblindness. And what child-guided assessment refers to, the philosophy behind the assessment approach is involving making a partnership. We're going to partner with that child. We're going to get into that child's world. We're going to get into that child's physical space as much as she will tolerate. And we're going to invite that child out of her own body to join us in the world. I love this phrase. I think for kids with very severe vision and hearing losses, that's it. They're trapped in their bodies because they don't see and hear the world out there. So they're trapped in here, and we're going to invite them out of their bodies to join us in the world, to interact with that environment, to build connections. I wish that were my phrase. It's not, but I love it. One of the handouts I provided for you is a general summary of child-guided assessment. And I have created it with a table that's going to show up in the next slide with some of these primary guidelines about child-guided assessment. When you're doing this kind of approach, it relies on you as the assessor to read that kiddo, read that kid's body language. If it's a baby, if it's a toddler, if it's a preschooler, read the kiddo's body language, read the kid's emotions. Is he scared? Is he mad? Is he happy? And follow his lead. It's like, oh, you don't like that when he's scowling and you don't like that. Let's do something else. Or if he's happy, ooh, you want to do that some more. You knew this, but this constitutes child-guided assessment, which is your best source of information to try to get a handle on deafblindness. You have to concentrate and observe. You have to be attuned with the child. Folks in Europe are much better about attunement than we are, in my opinion, but it's just like plug into that kiddo. What does he like? What does he not like? What does he feel? What does he want? Try to guess. Will you always be right? No, you won't. but you'll be you'll be right more often if you try to guess what that child might be saying to you with his behavior than if you don't try to guess, right? And so when you're doing an assessment, try to find out, what is he like? What interests him? What does he prefer? Does he prefer to lie down? Then do your assessment when he's lying down on the floor. Does he prefer to stand up? Then do your assessment when he's standing up. Don't try to make him sit in a high chair. What is his favorite thing? Make that available. That when he's interacting with you, then you introduce that favorite thing. And when he's not interacting, you try something else. And when he starts interacting again, introduce the favorite thing. Use those interests and motivation. So this is the chart that you have. And this is my interpretation of their 10 basic areas that Van Dyke and Nelson talk about. You have to, and we're going to talk really quickly about each one, because I've tried to give you information about these most essential ones, okay? And as an extra handout. Behavior state, withdrawal, vision, hearing, touch, orientation to others, memory, social interaction, communication, problem solving. My guess is that looks like a developmental approach that many of you take anyway, but this structures it as part of a child-guided approach. I think one thing that might not be on your general developmental checklist would be some assessment of biobehavioral state or behavior state, which simply has to do with the child's level of arousal. All right? Arousal. That is he awake or is he asleep? That's that notion that no matter what you do, you can't get the baby to wake up. And this is true with kids who are typically developing too, right? How you want them to wake up when it's daytime and you want them to sleep at night, and trying to get those rhythms and their cycles. You try to fight against behavior state, because behavior state is controlled by that baby's neurological system. And as things get integrated with the neurological system, things start to shift and be open and responsive to things in the environment. So you really think that maybe after 6 to 8 weeks, you've made a change in your baby's behavior to help them to be awake when you want them to be awake and asleep when you want them to be asleep. Not so much. The child's neurological system is just maturing, but that's a simplification. But behavior state, it talks about as a kid, deep in sleep, to active alertness, to agitation, and this is all controlled internally. And it integrates and is no longer the major control center with babies who are typically developing and don't have disability. But for children who experience neurological disability, behavior state can be a primary influence in their lives for years and years. Research varies. There's 6 to 9 behavior states, but it can be influenced by external environmental factors. So you have a handout. It's an electronic document called Learning Environment Characteristics. It's a listing of different variables and a checklist in terms of physical, people, social, position, movement, as well as vision, hearing, and so on. Different things in a learning environment you can manipulate to try to influence a behavior state, to try to move a kid from a state of sleep or drowsiness into a state of alertness. So check out that document. It might be important to you. I think we can skip that part. The second variable is about approach or withdrawal. And these are just some questions I generated. You can have others, but like, does the child consistently seem to turn away from certain events, certain people, certain objects? Does he seem to approach or really be drawn to certain things? What does that child do to indicate he wants to engage with you? What does he do to say, I'm done, I'm through? And it's obvious if they pick something up and throw it away, right? But sometimes kids aren't that obvious. They use their behavior. They roll over. They close their eyes. A kid who has severe hearing loss, it's identified, they'll close their eyes and say, I'm done with you. right? Pay attention to those things. The key is to remember to maximize sensory access, especially about vision, hearing, touch. Vision, hearing, touch. So that's where we're going next. Vision. You have a document in as a handout. It's called Assessment Overview, Vision Assessment Overview. It's an older document, but I really like it as an informal tool to get information about 5 areas of visual skills. And this expands that vision table that I gave you earlier. All right. And it's going to look at these questions like visual engagement or disengagement. And does the child use vision with other senses or only in isolation? Does the child get meaningful information from vision? And it talks about localization. It talks about gaze shift, grasp, release, looking at objects. There's 5 areas on this checklist that you can do. I don't know that I recommend you necessarily doing this as a formal assessment without the support of a teacher of the visually impaired, but I think you can use it just to get some idea of what might be going on with a little one, so you have more information to take to a teacher of the visually impaired. Hearing, the same questions. Does the child use hearing with or without other senses? How does the kid relate to auditory stimuli? What is going on? Does he use information? Does he appear to use information from his hearing? This is the most important thing about hearing. The single most important impact of a severe or profound hearing loss is the effect on that kiddo's communication development, the effect on that language development. And for this, you have another document as well. It's the FAPI document, FAPI, Functional Auditory Performance Indicators. It gives you information about these 7 areas of auditory skill development. And just as I said about the visual assessment information I provided, I don't recommend you do this as part of a structured assessment without the input of an audiologist, and you don't report this as a final auditory assessment to a family without input from a teacher of the deaf or an audiologist. But it's going to give you, as an early childhood specialist, some information to try to decide and get more. It gives you things to look at in terms how a child is aware of sound, or is sound meaningful, or how they can localize the sound. And it gives you 7 categories. It has a 4 step rating scale. It's not observed, it's emerging, that kind of thing. So hopefully that will be useful to you in conjunction with that table I gave you earlier. Same things, same things. Does he use touch in combination with other senses or only in isolation? How does a child relate to touch? Does he use the information meaningfully? It's very important to remember that with kiddos who experience deaf blindness, the earliest expression of memories likely will include tactile and movement aspects. Tactile, I can't get my cursor to show you tactile and movement aspects, but it's the bottom bullet. How does a child orient to other stimuli? If it's a person, an object, a sound, an event, and it's not only being aware of a stimulus, that's a more primitive level, but it's how does the child direct his attention to that stimulus in some way, to orient to it visually, auditorily, with body position, what kind of stimuli seems to trigger this, all of these kind of things. If you start looking in these categories, you will get information to get a well-rounded assessment. Memory, movement aspects of a child's experience, as well as touch, we said it previously with touch, has a very significant impact on earliest memories. Movement, touch, really important. Movement and touch. And this is for kids with deaf blindness, even beyond the birth to 2, 3 to 5. It's movement and touch are critical. We have a lot of questions about memory. you could write these as well as I can. You know, how many times does a child need to be exposed to a stimuli to really habituate to it? Does a kid notice if something changes? Notice of change is a memory activity because there has to be holding in memory of what it was before and what it is now. And does he react differently? Does a kid react differently to people that are familiar and unfamiliar? Adults, children, different spaces. If you feed him with a different bowl and a different spoon, does he notice? That's a memory activity. Lots of questions. Social interactions, you know this. When a person approaches the child, does she orient in some way? That's an overlap with that orienting responses 2 variables ago. Does the child appear to demonstrate that he's bonded with caregivers? Do you do that basic turn taking? I've used that turn taking example many times today, and turn taking games, and how many turns will a child take? This is just but one thing. How many turns will he take before he says, I'm done, I'm through? That's all social interaction. It's very important. Everybody communicates. Everybody communicates. So during an interaction, during an assessment, please expect that that child is going to communicate with you. Expect that. Because if you expect the child's communicating by the way he acts on objects, acts on you, acts on his own body, manipulates his body, moves, touches, he's telling you valuable information. Come on. It's very important to notice if the child initiates communication or if he only responds. And how does he initiate? Does he make sounds? Does he make gestures? Does he use body movement? Does he use the same thing with people he knows and people he doesn't know? All of those questions, that's what this says. All of those questions inform your assessment to try to create a meaningful picture of that child. What possible meanings does the child appear to communicate? Is everything no, protest, reject, or does he also communicate happy, content, curiosity, want? Can he make choices? That's really important. If kids can make choices, is he able to understand that one thing can stand for another thing? That's a huge key to future development. And the very last one, I've just tried to supply you with a lot of questions. I'm reading a lot of them, talking about them, but not all of them. Does the child understand cause and effect? You know that. You look at that from the Piagetian assessment and sensory motor development all the time, right? Cause and effect, means, ends behavior. One thing stands for another thing. He knows what goes together functionally, that toothpaste and a toothbrush function together. Those kinds of things are really important for problem solving. Does he persist at a task or does he discourage easily? Does he give up? How long will the child persist at a task? All of that has to do with problem solving and could give you a window into the child's world. Okay, I'm going to take about 5 more minutes and then we'll have 10 for questions. I want to talk very briefly about formal assessment. We could do 2 hours on formal assessment, but my feeling is that as early interventionists, you don't typically put your priority on formal assessment. You really use your observational assessment, family interview, records review, and you supplement with formal. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but I think that's the way we best approach the identification of deafblindness. The one test, if you will, that I want to talk about is the communication matrix. I know that Lisa has been providing some in-service in the state of Indiana with a couple teams right now around the communication matrix, which is developed in Oregon by Dr. Charity Rowland. It's a wonderful tool that it's easy to fill out with a family online. It's free. And for kids who who demonstrate only really, really, really early communication skills, and they communicate through ways other than talking and other than writing, which is going to be your kiddos in a lot of respects, and young kiddos with deafblindness, it's a great way to get a handle on their skills. You get a profile like this, and you can't read this per se, but this gives you, there are 7 levels, okay, from pre-intentional behavior up here through formal language down here, all right? It gives you developmental information on communication from birth to 24 months across these 4 functions. That's these 4 rectangles down here: refuse, obtain, socially interact, and get information. And you get a profile generated automatically after you fill it out online, whether something is not yet started, that's the white. If it's surpassed or mastered is gray. If it's emerging or in progress, it's the gold and salmon color. It's a wonderful tool. I've given you information here. These are the 9 types of communication messages or modes. Some are, look at, they're visual, they're concrete symbols, they're postural changes. So you have the information about the kinds of questions the matrix asks. This is their website, and you can purchase paper copies or PDF for your own use of the matrix off that site. They're all under $10. There's another wonderful resource on the matrix through the West Virginia Department of Ed. A lot of my stuff is included in there. A lot of the stuff Nancy Steele has developed. She's working with Lisa in Indiana now on the matrix training. You can use this website if you want to. That's just information for you to access. These are the 2 things that I have referred to about National Center on Deafblindness. They have an early ID and referral self-assessment guide, totally free. Go to this website. It's just 4 or 5 years old. They have an early identification and referral toolbox, multi-page manuals and guides to help you begin to get a handle on possibly identifying kids with deafblindness. You have some other assessment tools mentioned here. My guess is, as early childhood folks, you use the MacArthur Bates Communicative Development Inventories. There are 3 levels, these CDI inventories. The first one, words and gestures, 8 to 18 months. Words and sentences, 16 to 30 months. And the 3, CDI 3, 30 to 37. These are really where we focus. This is one of the ones that Lisa and I used in the study we did together 20 years ago. But they can be very helpful in identifying kids with deafblindness. These other instruments that I've included, they weren't developed for use with kids with deafblindness. They were developed for kids with autism, but they can be real helpful. And there's some resources. I really don't have anything to say about the resources. I did not intend to talk about them. You might say, well, she's just not talking about them because she's at 120 and her time's up. No, I didn't intend to, because you can read. I don't have a lot more to give you on this other than to tell you about it. This gives you a breakdown of what's in that toolbox that I mentioned earlier. This gives you a breakdown of what's in that self-assessment referral guide that was on the slide a few slides ago. I've given you one final handout. It's the HEAR document. That's a hierarchy of early auditory responses. Gives you developmental information, birth through 18 months of age, with examples, what these 6 skills look like. I hope that those will be helpful to you. And I need to shut up because now it's 1:21 and we need to have some questions. While you might be populating, I see there's another question about the CAPD follow-up. We'll try to get to that. While you're writing, if you have some questions, I will tell you that Lisa and I have another webinar for you 2 weeks from today, same time, same station, new Zoom link. Shouldn't have said it that way. There will be a new Zoom link where we will build on this and talk about the nitty gritty nuts and bolts of how you implement strategies with kiddos, young kids, early intervention with kids who have deaf blindness. I'll be talking about strategies for use in the NICU, in the home, and in an on-site preschool. So if you can join us, that's great. If you have other questions we don't get to today, there's my email, there's my phone number, call me up. I'm very willing to talk with you. Email me. The only thing I ask is if you do that, please connect me, say, well, I was in that Indiana webinar. Okay, that's all I need to know. So thank you. Thank you for your attention. Lisa, I only see the one question about the CAPD. Do you have other questions that have come straight to you? Thank you, Joy, for your question, for your comment. Appreciate that.
No, I don't have anything else, just the one is so far.
Well, let me go ahead and respond to that. Folks, if you have questions, I know I haven't been that clear. It says, I'm working with a 3-year-old who seems to have some hearing loss. I would love more information or guidance about CAPD. He doesn't respond to his name. He has had some hearing testing. I think have you, Pam, you're not an audiologist, are you? I think I would talk with an audiologist for sure. The kinds of things that I would encourage you to experiment with would be shake up and vary how you say his name. You say he doesn't respond to his name. Well, is that if you say it, if mom says it, if dad says it, if brother says it, if you have it on a recording?
Anyone.
Huh?
Anyone who says his name. I actually am a developmental therapist, but this happens to be my grandson who was in speech therapy. So my granddaughter is now very concerned. She's looking to what actually is wrong with him. He has qualified for the special needs preschool, and she's just beside herself thinking that there's something more in depth wrong. And this is the first time I've heard of this. And this, being a developmental therapist, I see all the things that you talked about with the CAPD in him. He says words, they're sporadic and they're not consistent. He makes noises a lot. Not horrible noises, but he says the word speed a lot. He very rarely says mama. So it's just, I don't think when we speak to him, it's registering with him. He is now making a lot more eye contact than he was. First Steps has the MChat, which they do for a child that they think might be on the spectrum with autism or something. And he passed the MChat. He didn't seem to have those characteristics.
Well, let me give you a couple of comments, Pamela, and we'll see if I can come up with some more information to get to Lisa for you. Like I
Awesome.
think that just because I would say the notion about that mama is afraid that something might be wrong, if you can help her to reshape her thinking that something might be different, get away.
That's what I've tried.
And
that's exactly what I say.
And just because a kid might have passed one assessment that says he doesn't have a disability, he's on the spectrum, doesn't mean he's not. I mean, he might be, might not be, but once is not, a one-time thing is not enough. And when I say try different things, it's like if it's people, but always people saying his name, record it on something and have it be a mechanized, synthesized speech. Come at him with different kinds of sound sources. Come at him and see if he responds differently to different kinds of sound sources, not only male and female voices, but like I say, an authentic recorded speech and a synthesized speech, that robotic type of speech. But some kids will respond to that when they won't respond to a voice. Change it up on him. try to do different things in different conditions. If it's a sound to noise ratio, if you've ever heard of sound to noise ratio, try them in different kinds of environmental sound conditions. There's a lot of just experimental things you can try, and we'll try to get you some more information. You can look up CAPD and you can get some information on it. So
I did. As soon as you said it, I pulled it up on my other computer.
okay. So we'll try to see what we can do. Kirby's got a comment, and I think I would like to address Kirby's comment, because my guess is she's not the only one that has this question. And Christine has a comment too. We'll get to that. Kirby says, any examples or encouragement I would recommend sharing with families when they are concerned about their child with a new diagnosis of deafblindness. Many parents ask what to expect or how their child will function. That is absolutely true, Kirby. You are so right about that. And it's scary as hell when you hear deafblindness. I think the kinds of things that I would reassure a family about, Lisa, chime in. Deafblindness does not mean hear nothing, see nothing. It does not mean that. Of the 10,441 kids nationwide, less than 5% hear nothing, see nothing. It doesn't mean that. It just means something is different with vision, something is different with hearing. And I use different rather than lesser or wrong, all right? So reassure them about that. The kid's going to still be able to use his vision unless he doesn't have eyeballs. All right, make sure you know he's got eyeballs. I've known some kids don't have eyeballs. They're not going to see if they don't have eyeballs, okay? But if they have eyeballs, there are things we can do to help them use what vision they have. There are things we can do to help them use what hearing they have in functional ways. There are, on the NCDB website, there are lots of success stories under the family section about young adults with deafblindness who have gone to college, who live independently, who, even though they have cognitive impairment, physical disability, also they live in supported home, they have supported employment. There are lots of stories about how well kids can do. Help them know that today influences tomorrow, but today does not predict tomorrow, because today we're not able to predict. And get them to try to live in the present and share success stories with them. You can't share them as guarantees because we don't know. Because some kids who have deafblindness can't be independent, but we have to keep the door open. Okay. Lisa, you want to say anything, or want to let me say something about Christine? And we're at 129.
Yeah, I'll hurry. I did want to add yes to everything that Susan just said. I would also add, first of all, when I talk to families about deafblindness, I call it combined vision and hearing loss. It feels a little less scary, maybe not a lot, but a little. And secondly, encourage them to contact us, because we try, if they want to, we try to put them in contact with other families who maybe have been there just a little bit before they have, so they can talk. That's some of the best things that happen, is to put families in touch with other families.
Love that, Lisa. Thank you. Thank you for helping me with that. Last comment, and then we're going to be at 1:30. Christine makes the comment when we were talking about the little fellow with CAPD. Encourage mom to discuss this with her IEP team, IFSP team. If he has an IFSP team, absolutely. Yes, 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 Christine, you are so right. I should have said it. I just can't think of everything. Yes, mom's concerns need to be shared with school, even if there's no IFSP. Those concerns need to be shared with school, and she needs to be encouraged to document things at home. And documenting is so much easier now. We got these things. I hate these things in so many ways, but you can make a 3-second video of how he responds to or fails to respond to certain auditory stimuli, especially if you find something to which he does respond. Record it, share it with the school team. It's really important. So thank you for that, Christine. I think we're done.
Thank you all.
Okay, I do think we're done, and I don't want to keep you guys too much over our 2:30 time frame. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Susan, for all of your information. I did want to say, You are all registered for part 2. And I will be sending that information and the link out. It will not be until Monday before the 2nd, because honestly, I'm gone on vacation. Sorry, guys. In between. So you'll get that information that Monday before the 2nd for that particular workshop. And I will be sending you yet today an email with a link to your post-test and your evaluation for today. Thank you again for everybody being here, and I think we're all finished.
I have one final thing, Lisa, if I may. No, I lied. I have 2. That's me, Thank you all again. You had other ways to spend 2 hours. Thank you for choosing to spend it with us. And I want to personally thank Jennifer, who's our interpreter, who has been at this for 2 hours trying to keep up with us. And let's all give Jennifer a hand, because you should be tired, lady. And I appreciate your service very much. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks. And we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Hope so. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Lisa.
Bye, Susan.
Bye-bye.